in Isaiah chapter 10, and we're down to verse 28, but this section starts back in verse 24. So kind of going back to that, basically verses 24 through verse 34, the end of the chapter, it is a section which is stating, "Do not fear Assyria." Now, Assyria was the main power at that time. But God is revealing to them that in a short space of time, that's verse 25, in fact, short space of time, God's going to destroy Assyria. But they're going to come, and as they do, they're going to be destroying much of the southern kingdom, as far as the cities of the southern kingdom. But they will not enter into Jerusalem. Now, we all know what happens to them. But if you go back into verse 27, he says, "It shall come to pass in that day that his burden shall be taken away from off thy shoulder, and his yoke from off thy neck, and his yoke shall be destroyed because of the anointing." So now then, that brings us to verse 28, where we had gotten to. He is come to Aoth. He is passed to Migron. At Michmash he hath laid up his carriages. Basically, this is the Assyrian army that he's dealing with. And their march toward Jerusalem. The first city that he mentions, he's come to Aoth. That is the same as Ai. Now, you all remember what happened at Ai, right? Well, that was at Jericho that caused their defeat at Ai. When Achan took the accursed things. And as a result, they were defeated by the men of Ai, and then they went back after they had taken care of the sin that was in the camp, and they defeated Ai. It was in the north part of Benjamin, about 15 miles north of Jerusalem. So this isn't 15 miles isn't very much to us today, but there's going to be these other cities that they have to go through. Michmash is about 9 miles north of Jerusalem. So he's coming down Ai, then Migron, now then Michmash, 9 miles at this point in time. And it says that he laid up his carriages. Well, what in the world would that mean? It's very simply that the heavier equipment they leave behind. They leave it there so that they would be lightly equipped for the siege at Jerusalem. They don't need the heavier equipment. In other words, they just need to get to Jerusalem. So that's the idea of they laid up his carriages, those heavier burdens or those heavier items that would be slowing them down. In verse 29 then, they're gone over the passage. They have taken up their lodging at Geba. Ramah is afraid. Gibeah of Saul is fled. they are gone over the passage. The passage here is the Wadi at Michmash. If you look at 1 Samuel 13 and verse 23, someone turn over there and read that.
The garrison of the Philistines went out to the passage of Michmash.
Okay, to the passage of Michmash. That's the area in which they would be going through. So they lodged there for the night at Gibeah then. Ramah is afraid. Ramah is 7 miles from Jerusalem. Apparently, they're not coming in a direct straight line. They're going a little bit sideways, and as they're working their way down to Jerusalem. But Ramah is 7 miles from Jerusalem. Then he mentions Gibeah of Saul is fled. That is, Gibeah is the birthplace and the residence of Saul, King Saul. And it would be in Benjamin. Someone turn over and read 1 Samuel 11 and verse 4.
Then came the messengers to Gibeah of Saul and told the tidings in the ears of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept.
Okay. Again, it identifies this Gibeah of Saul. It's where he resided, and was born. There's another Gibeah, which is in Judah. This one is in Benjamin, though. So, and as I say, it's getting closer. The Syrian army getting closer and closer to Jerusalem as they're coming down through this way. In verse 30, lift up thy voice, O daughter of Gallim, cause it to be heard unto Laish, O poor Anatoth. Gallim is another town in Benjamin. Here, the daughter of Gallim was crying aloud, so loudly that it was heard in Laish. This again, there's another or a couple of Laishs. There's one in Dan, which would be the very northern part of the kingdom, or the Palestine. But this one is near Jerusalem. So these daughters of Gallim were crying aloud so loudly it was heard in this other town that was near them. Anatoth, poor Anatoth, is about 3 miles from Jerusalem. So we see starting out at 15 miles, and now then we're getting pretty close, 3 miles away. Anyone know of anything special about Anatoth? Yes. It's where Jeremiah was from, or his birthplace. So that would be the way in which we would recognize it. Poor, when he says, "O poor Anatoth," it's poor as applied to it in pity. On account of the impending calamity that was coming, the Assyrian army coming and going to destroy them. Not so much possessions or wealth-wise, but poor from the standpoint you're about to get destroyed. And so from that aspect, they are, oh, poor Anatoth. In verse 31, he says that Madmenah is removed. The inhabitants of Gibeon gather themselves to flee. So Madmenah is another village near Jerusalem. While the King James says is removed, later translations say that they fled. So if it is fled or removed, it would be removed from the standpoint of them fleeing. They have removed themselves from the city. They're fleeing because of the fear of the Assyrians coming. And the Assyrians will destroy them. If so, instead of hanging around and being destroyed, they get out of town in a very literal sense. And also those in Gibeon, they likewise flee for their safety. If you get the idea that Assyria is a powerful nation, that's the idea that you're seeing through these. But also, just think as they're coming down, they're getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. And nothing really is able to stop them. They're going to be there. How long ago it's going to take? It's not going to be long. So it's bringing about a fear from the standpoint of those in Jerusalem. Even though it was well fortified, it was their capital city. It would be the last stand, if you will, would be in Jerusalem. But all of these other cities, they don't even stand a chance, and so they're leaving. And verse 32, and yet shall he remain at Nob that day. He shall shake his hand against the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. Remaining at Nob that day. Basically, they take a day of rest. They rest there. Nob would be northeast of Jerusalem on Olivet. And it was the town of priests. So a priest would have been there, and not so much the warriors, but it would have been easy for them. And so now then, before they get to Jerusalem, let's take a break for a day and rest and relax. But at Nob, it says that he shakes his hand against the mountain of the daughters of Zion. Well, Paul just expressed it real well and what exactly that means. So if everyone would have been looking at Paul at that time, you would have seen it. It's shaking his fist at somebody. They are literally within sight of Jerusalem at this point in time. They can see the city. And they're standing there shaking their fist at them. That's the idea of shaking his hand, is literally his fist. So they're saying, we're coming to get you. You better be ready. And not only could they see Jerusalem, but those at Jerusalem would be able to see them. And knowing the power of the Assyrian army, it's going to be a scary thing for them. Then in verse 33, he mentions, "Behold, the Lord of hosts, shall lop the bow with terror, and the high ones of stature shall be hewn down, and the haughty shall be humbled." In other words, now then that Assyria has gotten to this point, God says, even though they've been coming for you, Jerusalem, they're going to be destroyed. God's going to destroy the Assyrians. Notice the Lord of hosts. What does host mean? The armies. Here's the Lord of armies. And we could elaborate a great deal. If you've got God's army with you, who's going to be able to stand against that? In Assyria, you think you're powerful and you can do anything? Well, the Lord of armies is with us. The Lord of hosts. Lop shall lop the bow with terror. Lop is to cut off. The bow, I guess I'm pronouncing that right, probably not, but is the main branch of the tree. So he's going to cut off the main branch of the tree. That's what he's saying. In other words, in this case, God is going to cut off the main part of Syria. And he's going to do it with terror. The ESV has terrifying power. I think that's interesting, whether or not it's an accurate translation. It certainly expresses more the idea that God is going to do this with a terrifying power. And he's going to he's going to chop down or cut down the high ones. And the figure of a tree or something, it might be the upright stem of the tree. And he's going to cut it down. He's going to bring down the arrogant and humble them. Think of some passages, or can you think of something maybe that Solomon said along the line of the proud or the arrogant? That pride does what? Goes before destruction. Haughty spirit, what? Before fall. If you're Sennacherib, now who's Sennacherib? He's the king of Assyria. He's the king who is now coming against Jerusalem and has defeated all of these other nations. Well, that's the whole point. If he's defeated all of these other nations, doesn't that make you kind of proud or arrogant? Later on in Isaiah, I think it's around chapters 37, 38, and 39, we have really in those chapters the same thing that Isaiah is talking about now. Isaiah is not written in a chronological way. So you might deal with Assyria here. Later you're going to deal with Babylon and Moab and all of these other nations. And then later on he's going to come back and talk about what he's talking about here. And if you read that, you will see that Sennacherib had sent his general He Rabshakeh. Rabshakeh is basically not a specific individual. It deals with a title, like we would use a general. So he sent this individual to Jerusalem, and he ridicules them, tells them, even if we gave you all of these instruments of war and these chariots, you still wouldn't even be able to fight against even the smallest of Sennacherib's army. And so you see, especially there, as you read that, the arrogance of Sennacherib, but also all of the Assyrians in reality. They were an arrogant people that nobody can destroy us, nobody can defeat us. We've defeated every nation that's come upon us. And as a corollary with that, in the thinking of the people of that day, each of these towns had a certain god. And you take two nations, they're going to battle against each other. Each of those nations have their own god. If one nation, or when one nation defeats the other, that means that their god is greater than the other person's god. And so that's the thinking also of the Assyrians. We've defeated every god that we've come upon. You think your God's going to help you and be able to deliver you from, Rabshakeh is saying, from Sennacherib's hand? Don't fool yourself. Your God's going to be just like everyone else's. He's going to go down in defeat. And so it is an arrogance that's going to be destroyed by God. And that is a beautiful section of Isaiah, because you see the insults, the trying to humble the city of Jerusalem and Hezekiah. And he, because of his belief in God, takes this letter that he gets and he gives it to Isaiah, and he goes to God in prayer and says, look at what he's saying. And he lays it at God's hand, and God basically says, don't worry, they're not going to set a foot in here. They're going to be gone. You're a little bit low in your figure, but yes, that is what's going to take place. It's 185,000. Not the 145. You're a little low there, but what's 40,000 among friends?
Pretty good indication of prophecy and inspiration.
It is. That God knew what he was going to do. And even though, again, Sennacherib and his armies are arrogant and thinking that nobody can defeat them, and I say 185,000 going to be destroyed. And that pride has gone before a fall. And it was a very hard fall. Verse 34 then, he mentions, and he shall cut down the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. the iron axe is what he's dealing with, that cuts down that fells the trees of the forest, is going to basically cut down Assyria, is what he's saying. That's the 185,000 who died in one night. They went to sleep one night, and when those that woke up, there's 185,000 of them that did not, because they were dead. That's a huge number of soldiers, isn't it? And to think that they lost that many in one night without any battle or anything else. They weren't sick or anything like that. They were well rested because they had taken that day of rest at Nob. And so everything's ready for the battle, except a huge part of their army's dead now. Lebanon here is a forest and represents the Assyrian army. And it says, they shall fall by a mighty one. That mighty one is, of course, God. Someone turn over to Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 21. Actually, just back a few verses.
The remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God.
Unto the mighty God. Here's the mighty one. It is Yahweh. Someone turn back to chapter 9 and read verse 6 for us.
Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
Okay. Here specifically referencing the Messiah, and he is referred to as that mighty God. Again, mighty one. And he's going to destroy the Assyrian army. Sennacherib, who is the king at the time, at this point in time, he is at the height of his success. And this is, at this point, couldn't have been any better. It wasn't something he was declining in power. If anything, he was still growing in power until this took place. Anybody remember what happens at this point? This chapter stops, but as far as what happens as far as Sennacherib and the Assyrians, okay, he goes home and gets killed. How? By two of his sons, actually. When he was worshiping his God, and two of his sons kill him, and another son, Esarhaddon, then becomes king. So very quickly now, with the destruction of, to a great extent, the destruction of his army at Jerusalem, he runs home and he's killed by his sons, two of his sons. So from the height of his power, the height of his greatness, to being dead. A very quick and a very great fall. that takes place. So any questions now about chapter 10 or about this situation with the Assyrian army? See, I told you I'd get through chapter 10 tonight. Yes.
What years are these?
What year would be this time frame? When what? Where's the chronology that I gave you? I still have a copy of it. There's still a couple copies if you don't have one. Hezekiah becomes king in 716. And 701 would be when Sennacherib attacks Judah and Jerusalem. So that gives you, and of course, when you give those specific dates, realize that if you looked at somebody else, you might see some different figures. Dates are always approximate, especially when you're dealing this far back in history. And then Hezekiah actually dies in 696. So, see, I told y'all needed to keep this, and some of you still have it. But that gives you a time frame. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to enter into chapter 11, even though we won't get far. And also, we'll take about a 12-week interval. But in chapter 11, we really have a chapter that is kind of an interlude, in a sense, from what has been talking about. In the first 5 verses, we have Emmanuel's divine government. That's the way I titled this section. So that's verses 1 through 5. And he says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Lord. And shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And the righteousness shall be of the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins." So here we have this divine government of this Emmanuel, this one who's going to be coming from the stem of Jesse. So verse 1, "There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." While this seems to be quite different from what we've been going through in the previous couple chapters, the destruction of Assyria, this might be here to show a great contrast. Assyria is going to be destroyed. Now, what did they said in relationship to Jerusalem? We're going to destroy you. We're going to wipe you out. So a contrast between, in reality, Assyria is destroyed. Now then, here's what's going to happen to Israel, to Jerusalem.
Big contrast between Sennacherib and this little twig is growing up, big magnificent army, and all the little twig is growing up here, going to wipe it completely out.
That's a good contrast, is what it is. Here is the great might of Assyria, his great armies, and here's this little twig, a little stem or rod out of the stem of Jesse. And that rod out of the stem of Jesse is the one who's going to destroy the Assyrian army. So it's a contrast between the two in reality. There's going to be a fateful shoot, rod, or stem that's going to come from the stock of Jesse. Now, who's Jesse? The father of David. So he is talking about the Davidic line now, that out of that Davidic line is going to come the Messiah. This rod was spouting up from the decayed and fallen tree. And it's going to grow up into a branch and thus overcome all opposition. Now then, tie that in with what chapter 10 is, the opposition of Assyria. But it's not limited to that idea of Assyria, but it's, again, a contrast between the two. That this branch is going to overcome all opposition, no matter what it might be. For this prophecy that we're going to see in chapter 11 to be fulfilled, there must be a genealogical record going back to David. You cannot help but avoid that. What happened to all the genealogical records of the Jews? Destroyed in AD 70 by Titus and the Roman armies. Thus, that was at AD 70. What do we have to conclude then? We have to conclude that the Messiah had to come before AD 70. I'm not saying at this point in time when that was. It just had to be before that time, because you'd no longer have the genealogical records, and this Messiah is going to come from the stem of Jesse. He's going to be from David. And so you had to have the genealogical records going back to at least David. But if you don't have them, you can't have the Messiah. Those who claim to be Israelites today, religiously, I'm not talking about politically or socially or anything like that, but those who believe from a religious standpoint, they have no hope for a Messiah today. They know that. There's no way in reality they can worship according to the law of Moses, and they know that. Why? What did the high priest have to do? High priest had to go in to offer sacrifices every year. But where did the high priest come from? From the tribe of Levi. Well, how do you know anyone's from the tribe of Levi today? How do you know anyone's a Jew today or an Israelite today? just because they claim to be. There's no genealogical record. And so there is absolutely no way they can practice the law of Moses after AD 70. You remember some of the warnings of Paul about endless genealogies? That's what he's talking about. Here are people trying to go back and trace their history back to, well, from a religious standpoint, they don't have a leg to stand on.
Well, Ben Bogart said he went all the way back to the apostles. Trying to get the first pope.
Trying to get the first pope. Well, yeah, they can't do that either.
They have to have the Ark of the Covenant.
Well, they'd have to have a lot of things, but and they don't have any of it. That's why I say they know they can't really worship according to the law of Moses. They don't even attempt to. Don't claim such.
They'd be real busy if they did, wouldn't they?
Yeah, somebody, if they claim to be, a simple question, when was the last time you were in Jerusalem? Because all male Jews had to return to Jerusalem 3 times a year. When was the last time you were there? Most of them never have been. We'll go ahead and stop there. We'll probably come back to this verse when we start back. Lord willing, next week we will start looking at that debate with the Roman Catholic priest.